Okay, hi everyone. I'm Heather Kirk. I'm SigEp's Chief Communications Officer, and welcome to our first year-round officer training session. We have an awesome a session for you today, all about communications and storytelling. And so hopefully this will relate directly to your work. I know over the past few months, we've all realized how, you probably already know, but realize a lot of people are realizing how important communications is, and that it even saves lives here in the COVID era. Today we have an awesome SigEp brother and guest here to share with us about the importance of communication and relating it to your work, either as a volunteer or as the VP of Communications in your chapter. Keith Bruce is a longtime leader in the sports marketing field. He's a 1987 graduate of our Illinois Alpha chapter at the University of Illinois. He's currently president of QuintEvents International and Formula One Experiences, organizing high-profile auto racing events for one of the world's most popular sports. Previously, he served as CEO of Super Bowl 50, leading an event that set viewership records and notably led to $13 million in charitable giving, really setting the pace for the NFL and the Super Bowl to be a charitable endeavor. Throughout his career, he's overseen sporting events like the Olympics, FIFA World Cup, PGA Tour, all around the world. And he cut his teeth at an agency working with the Gatorade campaigns to create the iconic Be Like Mike ads with Michael Jordan. He is a SigEp citation winner for all of that work, one of our very highest honors. And today he's coming to us from London. So thanks for being here with us, Keith. I'm going to kick it over to you. And like I said, guys, you can feel free to put questions in the chat. We'll do a Q&A. He'll take all your questions, or I can unmute you later. So either way works. And I'll kick it to you, Keith.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Nice to see everyone. I've got everybody up on the dashboard here, those that are willing to be on video. Otherwise, I see your name. So nice to meet you all. And as you can see, as Heather said, I'm based in London, so it's 9 o'clock at night here, so it's dark outside. But happy to join you guys and talk a little bit about the theme for the day, which is communications. I understand you're all communications officers in your respective chapters. I was not a communications officer for SigEp when I was in school at the University of Illinois. I did hold a couple of officer positions, but not communications. But during the course of my, 30 years in business and the last 25 years of it in sports, there's never been a more important time to focus on communications as a science, as an art, and as a skill. I've always considered myself to be a good communicator. When I ran Super Bowl 50, I had to do live media interviews, speak to hundreds or thousands of people. At the SigEp Citation Award ceremony at Conclave in Orlando, I had to stand up and do a speech to a couple thousand of the fellow brothers. So I feel like I'm an accomplished communications expert, only through experience and just trial and error. But in the last 6 months, I have to say I've never found, being a leader of an organization, and I've been president or CEO of the last 4 or 5 companies that I've worked with, and there's never been a more challenging time as it relates to communication. So what Joe and Heather have asked me to do is, and Brian Warren, the SigEp CEO at the main headquarters, asked me to just kind of leave you guys with a few themes on how to think about communications in your chapter. I'm going to try to make it as relevant as I can and draw upon a few of my experiences. But I always like to do these types of sessions, but with leaving you with a few things you can write down and take with you and think about as you go about your work in the chapter. And hopefully it applies to your other sides of your life, whether it's, applying for a future career or a job, or your family, your friends, other parts of our lives, because there's never been a more important time to focus on proper communication. I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then I've got my timer here so I don't run over, and then I'm going to leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions. There always seems to be some questions, so anything I say or that I didn't bring up, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And even if you want to leave the topic of communications and talk about anything else, that's fine with me. But I just want to be conscious of your time. So as Heather mentioned, currently my job is president of QuintEvents International. We're a global sports rights management company based in Charlotte, North Carolina. I run the international division, which means I run everything but the United States, and I'm based in London. And I've worked mostly in the global sports business for the last 15 to 16 years, with the 3-year hiatus to be CEO of Super Bowl 50, which a few of the memorabilia that are behind me here, but that was a 3-year stint from 2013 to 2016. And when I ran Super Bowl 50, I thought communication was, always going to be a critical part of making sure that the Bay Area knew what was coming with the size and scale of Super Bowl 50, that Commissioner Goodell and the NFL were communicated to daily as to what was going on. I had a direct line into the head of Homeland Security, so we had a major security effort in play to make sure that we ran a very safe and secure Super Bowl at a time when there was a lot of threat and unrest in the world. You may or may not recall that, but that would have been in the January-February period of 2016. So there was a lot of focus on communication. And then when I moved to Formula One and running Quint, the communication changed. It came from being kind of mission critical communication to just being a good leader and making sure our team understood the mission at hand and communicating with Formula One about this brand new business that they'd spent millions investing in. But now you move to March 15th of this year, and the communication that came from Formula One, which said we are going to cancel the Melbourne Grand Prix, and that began a cadence of sports event shutdowns and basically city shutdowns around the world. So the first thing I'll leave you with is communication in a time of adversity, and that's where we are. Right? So communicating when things are good is easy. When you have good news to tell, it just rolls off your tongue. It's easy to say, it's easy to talk to, you can ad lib. But when it's a tough adversity time and people on the other end of your communication are feeling it, you have to be sharp. And it's hard work. It's much more difficult to communicate effectively in a time of adversity. But that's what we're all doing right now. And that's what I've been doing for the last several months, both on the receiving end and then delivering that communication to my 120 staff around the world. So, a few points. What does that mean? Communication in a time of adversity. So practical application for all of you. One is clarity of message, right? You need to constantly remind people who we are, why we're here, what we're doing, who we are. Yes, this crazy thing called COVID-19 has completely turned our world upside down and changed the way we live, we breathe, we think, and we interact. But that doesn't mean we stop living. That doesn't mean business stops. That doesn't mean academics stop. That doesn't mean sports stop. They go on. They're survivable institutions that are really uncrushable. But we have to be very clear about what we stand for. So that's number one. Number two, very frequent communication. Sometimes it's easy to say, I'll push that off to next week. I don't need to talk to them again about that. In a time of adversity, my staff expects some kind of communication from me every day. If they don't get it, they freak out. They're like, okay, what we didn't hear from them. What's going on? So you really need to be frequent in your communication, more so than a normal vice president communications officer might think they need to communicate. So if you're thinking you communicate once a week, you might want to rethink that and communicate 3 times a week. And don't worry about, I'm bombing them with information. There's never been a more important time for people to receive information. People are glued to their phones and their forms of outreach to learn more each day about what's going on in the world with COVID. Third is a calm leadership tone. Panic, anger, insecurity, that just simply does, more damage and more harm. And while you can rant and rave about a decision or who's doing what, at the end of the day, you have to put that aside and kind of rise above it and maintain a calm leadership tone in the delivery of everything you do. That will resonate with your audience. They will feel less nervous being on the end of that type of a communication. And then find the positive in every message. In this environment, it's just so easy to deliver the bad news. This happened, bars are closed. Over here in London, they just announced, well, they haven't closed the bars and the restaurants, but they close at 10 p.m. now. That's directly targeting the young population of the United Kingdom. You cannot meet in a group larger than 6 people, regardless, unless it's work or school related. So there's all these restrictions, right? So it's easy just to go to the negative, but you find a positive in every message you send. So look at every communication, every email, everything you have, and just, is there a positive in there? And if there isn't, go back and put one in and find something positive to communicate about. And then lastly, under this theme is be yourself. Zoom was pretty much a lightly used video conferencing tool for the better part of 2018 and 2019. We used it a little bit, largely because I was over here in the UK, and it made it easy to communicate with some of my staff in Singapore or Melbourne or Dubai or the States. Now it's an everyday occasion. This is what we do. And I don't think it's going to change much in the next 6 months, maybe a year. And certainly as people work from home, and when you get into the workforce, maybe by then offices will be back to a little more normal cadence. But it's shown the world that the world can be efficient by being able to see each other and hear each other. So this is actually, in my world, a better play, because I can see all of you, I can see my staff, I can interact with you, I can read your reactions, I can see how you react to communications that are being delivered to you. And it's become a lifesaver for the business community, and also for families who could not go see their parents or their grandparents because of the lockdown, or them being sheltered or shielding, as they say over here. But it allows families and friends and schools and academics and business to communicate far more effectively, in my opinion, than we might have done when we were going back to the old world of basically just giving somebody a quick call or sending somebody a quick terse email. So use that to your advantage. Use this new technology as a way to be a communications guru. That will pay off in your career almost immediately when you move into that part of your new world. So that's number one: communication in a time of adversity, and those points that I think you should just think about as you issue your communications. The second theme I leave you with is adaptation. In a normal environment, you have to be able to pivot. You have to be able to react to the day's news. Certainly with Formula One, we were shocked when we all flew to Melbourne, and suddenly one of the McLaren staff was tested positive, and it shut down the entire race, and it systematically started shutting down pretty much all of sport. But Formula One pivoted. They created an emphasis on a virtual race campaign where they created this virtual race series, and they got actual F1 drivers to get online like this in Zoom and compete with others who had qualified to race with them in a simulated online racing contest. And it drew millions of fans, completely surprised Formula One, and recruited new fans to the sport because people were desperate for any kind of activity related to interacting with Formula One. The second pivot was being able to create an environment at the live event that allowed them to go back. Formula One was one of the first races to go back and produce a live sporting event in July. July 4th was our first race in Austria. And there were, at the time, I think only the PGA Tour, maybe the week before, had produced its first golf tournament. And so we were on the leading edge of being able to get out there and create these biospheres that allowed the teams to travel, yes, without fans, but now we'll be the first major event in Europe to have fans this weekend in Russia, and then in 2 weeks in Portugal, where we'll reintroduce fans coming to the races, and our F1 Experiences product will be in operation. And again, that's just through studying the science, being able to completely change your game. Formula One changed their venues. They're going to Istanbul, Turkey. They're going to Portugal. They're going to Nürburgring, Germany. These were not on the schedule 2 months ago, 3 months ago. So the idea to be able to adapt and pivot with relevance. Another good example of being able to operate and become comfortable with the uncomfortable, which is a phrase I used to use at Super Bowl 50. I would tell my staff every day, you have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, because if you aren't, it'll show. And leaders are expected to to transmit a sense of being comfortable even in the very tense, tight times. About 2 weeks before we were to open Super Bowl City in San Francisco, our plans were laid, we were ready to go, and I got a call from my head of security based in Sacramento, California, who said that the head of Homeland Security would like to have a call the next morning. And so I thought, well, that's odd. I've never heard from Washington. I've always dealt with Sacramento. And we had a conference call, and on that call, I was informed that the national government, and particularly the Homeland Security and the Secret Service and the CIA were the three organizations that we reported to for our national security concerns around the Super Bowl. And effectively, we were informed that they were going to move our security at Super Bowl 50 from a basic check your bag, maybe a random wanding, and then you're into the venue. And this was a venue that was going to hold over 1.5 million people over 10 days. We were informed that we were now going to move to TSA level security, meaning airport grade level security. That completely changed our security model. I needed to now source 60 to 70 magnetometers, which are the things you walk through in an airport, not the ones that really do this, just the ones that detect metal. And we had to completely pivot in a record time to find and source magnetometers, to change our security model, and do everything without blinking an eye to the public to say everything is going to be ready and on time. And we could have contested the decision. We could have gone public with it. We could have asked them to bring in the National Guard. That would have freaked everybody out. Why are you bringing in the National Guard? So essentially, we were able to just simply deal with the news, operate comfortably with the uncomfortable, find solutions to the problem, and put it to bed. And so the third point I bring up with that is, things are going to change suddenly and without notice and without warning. And so you as communications officers need to be able to handle those changes. Wherever university you're in, there's going to be probably 10 policy changes going on in the next 6 months based on COVID. And it's going to be up to you to communicate to your brothers what's going on and why it's happening. So you have to clearly identify the actions you require from your brotherhood. It's one thing to just give them the news, but you need to call them to action. You need to be able to say, guys, this is what we have to do. And that's exactly what I did with my staff after I got off the phone with Homeland Security. I said, our world just changed, and here's what we have to do, and we have to do it now. And everyone moved into action, and in 3 business days, we found the magnetometers. We completely changed our security model. SFPD and Health and Human Services, every organization that we needed to get involved in solving for the problem came together, and we got it solved. But it wouldn't have happened if I had not given them the news, but then the direction to say, here's what we need to do, and here's how we're going to do it. But then at the same time, don't tell people. You want to make them advocates of your message. So you want to empower them. You want to give them the responsibility to deliver on what you're supposed to be delivering on. And in this environment, it's okay to say, I don't know. When someone comes back to you and says, well, why are we doing that? Why do we have to do this? It's okay to say, I don't know in this environment, probably more than ever. The third thing I'll leave you with is a quick one, but it may sound obvious, but it's so important in this time when you're communicating to your constituents. So it's one thing if you're the CEO and you're communicating to your staff, all of whom in some way, shape, or form report up to you, right? What you're doing is you're communicating to peers and your fellow brothers, and so you're doing what's called lateral communication, not hierarchical communication. Hierarchical communication really is about how you can motivate a team, give them direction, and let them go about getting things done under kind of a sense of order. Lateral communication is trying to get people to embrace what you're trying to tell them needs to happen. That means there has to be a lot of empathy in your messaging. The tonality is not one of condescendingness or order taking. It's really about empathy and understanding. Your staff, your people, your teammates, your brothers, they're the most important assets you have around you. You can't move to the next day without that community. So you really have to think of them as just that. It's community. So there's empathy and community in the communication. human capital, and spirit is what will get us through this. People have, I mentioned being able to pivot. Well, companies are now going from this, which is what we all had to wear, right? And then the sports companies said, hey, I think we're going to get in the game, and they create this, and you got Adidas and Nike and all of that. And now companies have pivoted to say you can go online and order your own custom masks to size and fit and what have you. This didn't exist 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 4 months ago. That just shows you how the world can take a negative and turn it into a positive, whether it's through business or social responsibility or other. And so backtracking a little bit to be able to adapt and pivot with your actions. The final point I'll leave you with is, in your communications, just take a look at them and say, am I staying positive? Am I focused? And is there something good in the communication? Number one. Number two, avoid taking sides. It's so easy to take sides and say, I'm going to go here versus there. Stay in the middle. Build consensus and stay in the middle. And number three is embrace the change. In my speech at Conclave, I talked about running towards the monster. Those that run away from the monster generally are never going to be able to manage conflict. They're never going to be able to get to the right solution because they won't address it. They won't embrace it. They won't look at it as real. COVID is real. The impact of the pandemic is real. And we just have to embrace it. And we just have to realize that this is the life we live now. So I leave you with those thoughts, those themes, pulling from a few of my own anecdotal stories from my business world, but we've got a few minutes and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, you guys, feel free to come off mute. Feel free to put questions in the chat. We have plenty of time. So what questions do you have for Keith?
Yeah, I can see the chat too, if anyone wants to send a message privately.
Something. So you talked about earlier, and I totally agree how effective Zoom's been lately. But to what extent do you think that Zoom can really take over in-person meetings? Because I know for our chapter, for example, we were starting to talk about trying to get chapter meetings back in person because over Zoom, it's not quite the same experience. So going forward, how far do you think these Zoom meetings can take over?
It's a great question, Stephen. I don't think they'll replace the in-person meeting when people are, in person, right? If you're in the same building or the building next door, in your fraternity house, I mean, the in-person meeting is always going to be paramount. It's really irreplaceable. My staff, we just opened up our offices over here on September 1st, and my sales director said he's never had more valuable engagements with his team over the last 3 months than in the last 3 weeks, where they could just walk into his office and ask a question about what's going on. And so the in-person exchange, I think, will never be replaced by Zoom, but I do think Zoom is here to stay. And I think it's very valuable when we're doing something like this, where we're in different parts of the city, the country, the state, the world, and we can interact in a real-time way. So I think Zoom is probably going to stay a permanent fixture in the business community. I think it'll become, a kind of like FaceTime, a moderately used entity for personal interactions once the restrictions calm down and people can get back into more in-person interactions. And then I think right now in the academic level, the online level, where your online classes are all through Zoom or Teams, I think it's going to stick around for a while. So I think it does have permanence. It will be permanently employed in some sectors of the world, and I think it will be lightly to moderately in play in probably the more social aspects of our lives.
Makes sense.
Yeah. I'm an investor in Zoom, so I want it to go up, but that's all right.
It's been a good past few months then in that area.
Yeah, it has. Any other questions?
I have one. How did you get into F1 specifically and doing events for them?
Yeah, Dash, thank you. Good question. You've got a good name for Formula One, by the way, Dash.
Thank you.
like things happen in our world, a little bit of skill and a little bit of luck, and being in the right place at the right time. Formula One was purchased by a company called Liberty Media, an American company, 3 years ago, and it just so happened that I was wrapping up Super Bowl 50 and putting a final bow on everything and shutting down the company, and was really just out there consulting and looking for my next gig, and really hadn't thought about what I wanted to do. And I got a call from the gentleman from ESPN, Sean Bratches, who had just been hired as the commercial director for Formula One under the new CEO, Chase Carey, who I also knew from his days running Fox Sports. So Chase Carey was one of the first guys that, brought in the yellow 1st and 10 line in the NFL, and the pitch tracker in baseball. So all those innovations that you watched on Fox when you guys were just growing up, he was instrumental in that. So had two of the smartest TV executives in the world, broadcast executives in the world now running Formula One, and I happen to know them both very well. So they talked about this new company they were going to create that broke down all these barriers and made it easier for fans to enjoy Formula One with experiences as well as hospitality. And there was a company they were talking to called QuintEvents. And I knew the founder, Brian Lurst, in Charlotte, because I'd done a lot of work with him at Super Bowl 50. They were working with NFL on location, and they were one of the top Super Bowl ticket sales companies in the country, the top Super Bowl ticket sales company in the country. And so QuintEvents had cracked the code and figured out a way to do this joint venture with Liberty Media to create this new company called F1 Experiences that really is a white label brand. QuintEvents runs it underneath, so we're kind of the intel inside of F1 Experiences. But when you go onto the website, it looks like Formula One. When we go on site, we're all in Formula One gear. So we don't wear QuintEvents. QuintEvents is the name underneath with all of our events, with all of our sports properties. So I just love the model, and I love the idea of transformational change. It's what I'd done at Super Bowl 50. And it was a big whiteboard that Liberty Media said, create this company and make it rock and see what can be done. And so I came over to London and I hired 30 people, and we went to work. And we sold $20 million of product in our first year. And Formula One was like, okay, you need to move to London. This is going. So I moved to London 2 years ago, and just in time for 2019, our second full year. And so that's I really did it for a variety of reasons, but I trusted the new Formula One management, even though I didn't know jack about Formula One. But I know how to run a sports business, and I know how to grow one from scratch because I'd done it twice before. And I think that's what they saw in me, is the ability to grow something from nothing, but with a base, right? Super Bowl isn't nothing, Formula One isn't nothing, but I had two awesome opportunities in a row in 2013 and in 2017 to come in and help this organization totally transform. What it means to run a Super Bowl or be a Super Bowl, and then what it means to totally change Formula One and make it more accessible to people around the world. So no buyer's remorse. I'm in spite of COVID and all the challenges it's brought to our industry, I'm still happy to be here and doing what we're doing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was really interesting.
So I have a question. With everything that's changing because of COVID, and now things are moving, Zoom and social media is taking more of a impact for guys like us in college, seniors going into the real world. Do you have any advice for us as far as using technology like Zoom and LinkedIn and those resources to help us now with COVID happening this year?
Are you talking about as you look towards a career post college?
Right. So as I look towards grad school or a career post grad. Yeah.
Well, it goes back to my last point. Just embrace this change and get comfortable with the technology. I find LinkedIn to be probably the most valuable business networking tool of all of them. Twitter is much more of Instagram is totally social. Facebook is and Twitter are kind of can somewhat point towards educational purpose, but they tend to be more social. LinkedIn is all about business people advancing other business people and getting to the right people. So I think Zoom is also, I think, incredibly important to stay in touch with those that you are ultimately going to be working with to try to find a job. Internships, networking. One thing to think about is you're going to be doing interviews via Zoom. And so when you're interviewing, you have to think about how do I look? What's the angle behind me? What room am I in? How's the lighting? How's the sound? Shut off all other forms of internet communication in the house so that you don't get disrupted. You have to think about all these things. I did this for tonight's call. So, I made sure that, you're prepared. All of your time is valuable. So you want to make sure that you are showing that person on the other end that I know your time is valuable and I'm ready for this call. I'm prepared for it. I've set my environment up so I won't be disturbed. And you're dressed appropriately, the lighting's right, and it just works. It's just like walking into a room in person. You want to make a great first impression. And in Zoom, you have that ability to do that. And sometimes people kind of just take that for granted and they say, oh, okay, I can roll out of bed and get on a phone call. Well, in certain environments, yeah, you can, but not a job interview. So, use the live environment that Zoom offers you, and treat it just like if you were there in person. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
On that, Keith, is there something as you've been interviewing people or your team maybe has, are there things that have stood out to you about communicators or potential communications team members as you're interviewing them in this unique environment, or even that things that they've referenced that they did in COVID? So for example, our team members here will be talking about how they communicated during this era. What has stood out to you or your team as you've hired people?
Yeah, I mean, there's not been a lot of hiring, to be honest, given the freeze in the industry. But for every one of us, there's people like Amazon and Zoom and others that have been hiring like mad, right? So I don't have as many anecdotal stories about in the interviewing process, hearing what's going on. It's just been more in the what I would call peer-to-peer communication. And I talk to a lot of my people who are running organizations, lateral to mine, even marginally competitive to mine, and just saying, how are you dealing with this? How are you communicating with your team? How are you communicating furloughs? How are you being creative with staff reviews or redundancies, which that's the UK term for layoffs. And so how are you dealing with these real human capital issues? And so, again, there's been a couple of really interesting examples where, the number one thing was morale. And how do you keep morale up in an organization when it's splintered and we're not in an office environment anymore, and there's no real security about the near-term future? People are nervous about their jobs. They're nervous about going outside, in the early days of this issue. And so Europe probably moved a little faster than the United States and got to a better place faster in the summer. And then the United States had a pretty bad spike in July and August, and now Europe is having a little bit of one now here in September. So it just goes to show you we're going to have to be resilient for a few more months at least. And so, I think it's hearing those stories of the way they do morale building and virtual happy hours, virtual think tanks, getting people around the Zoom at 5 o'clock. One company does, a Wine Wednesday. They just get everybody together and they get together and they just talk about their favorite wines, or they talk about their favorite beers, and they do this, and it just breaks the ice. It's just something that you just don't talk about in a business environment, but they do that because it just increases morale. So it's just being creative, and recognizing that your team, everyone's human here, and people get frustrated and they get a bit bent with the situation. So things that lift morale, like that, and stories and ideas. Not exactly a direct answer to your question about examples for interviewing and hiring, but I think I addressed that to some degree with Michael's question. But it's, and again, it all goes back to communication, right? It all goes back to people talking to each other through Zoom and Teams. The one thing I've heard more than anything is how much more efficient the day-to-day staff are, because They're working from home. They're not spending time commuting. They can generally find people because you're not, away from your office in a 2-hour lunch or chatting away in someone else's office. You're in front of your computer, or your phone, and you're available. And so that's maybe one of the positives that you can take from this, is people are more available, and generally they're more efficient.
Any final questions, guys, on the communications front for Keith?
I got one.
Yeah.
Keith, one of the things I was interested in this session was the topic, the story, the power of storytelling. And you've done very well in bringing in some of your stories to help get your message across. And I'm wondering if you could relate some of that to the undergraduates and some of the things that they're doing in their undergraduate career. For example, recruiting, especially, how to bring in stories to help recruit, to get a prospect interested in SigEp. Should they practice doing that? Should they come up with a canned story, or should they wing it? Those are the types of things that I think undergraduates would be interested in knowing about.
Yeah,
because that could relate to their careers when it comes time for them to search out internships and jobs and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no question, David. It's a very good point. It's a good question. Storytelling comes more natural to some than others. I found earlier in my career, I kind of had to work at it. It wasn't, while it may feel natural now or seem natural to my audiences, and it feels natural to me, it wasn't, when I was a SigEp at the University of Illinois, I was not an astute storyteller. I was social. I could, hang with anybody in any conversation, and was generally seen as, one of the more likable guys in the chapter. But, I wasn't a storyteller. We had some guys in the chapter that they could just whip up stories out of nowhere. And I was just like, God, how do they do that?
You can go overboard if you don't want
to. It can. Sure. So I think to that point, I think you have to find a relevant story. And so I talked about adapting, being able to pivot with relevance. I think you have to tell stories with relevance. If you're just storytelling to get a laugh out of somebody, or you're just storytelling to kind of, break the ice, that's fine, but I wouldn't make it a habit. I think what you need to do is lock in on storytelling that's relevant. So I thought about tonight's theme and subject matter, and I specifically wrote down a couple of related stories. The Super Bowl 50 story with the TSA security, the Formula One virtual, racing. I probably could have winged it and just kind of gone with the flow, but I thought about it, and I thought about what would be relevant for you guys to help to bring the points to life. And so what you're trying to do when you're recruiting is you're trying to create an environment that the recruitee is comfortable. B, you're presenting yourself as a likable representation of the chapter. And so telling a story or two about, hey, I remember when I was in your shoes, going around to 4 or 5 different houses, and if you can spin a good story or talk about what happened to you and why you ended up in the chapter the way you did, a funny story about your life in the chapter, your life in the university you're in, that would help kind of depressurize that conversation. Because storytelling depressurizes things. It gets people a little more comfortable with the back and forth, as opposed to just, a lecture, which, nothing wrong with a lecture, but that's a different type of communication, or a written script, right? So it's conversational in nature, but it's relevant, which means you have to think about it. Unless you're just one of those God-gifted people that can just, there's a few broadcasters, sports broadcasters, that can just grab stuff out of the air, unscripted, and be completely relevant in terms of telling a story. There's Tony Romo's very good at that, the current broadcaster for CBS, and there are a few others that could just tell a story while they're broadcasting the event. So I think, but I would bet you he would even tell you that he's thinking about those things before he goes on the air. So
seems like the thing that I would caution anyone thinking about that is make sure your stories aren't so long that the other person that you're talking to doesn't have a chance to tell their stories, because that's what you really want in a recruiting situation. You want them to open up, and if you can use a story to get them to open up and tell their stories, that's really what you're after. Because then when you do that, you'll learn a lot about the person and what they're representing.
That's right, David. It's almost thinking about making the storytelling conversational. We could have easily done that with those stories. I could have said, I'm going to tell the story, and the minute I say something, just raise your hand or chat, and we stop. But in a live environment, in a recruiting environment, or even if you're doing it via Zoom, because that's the way you have to do it, being brief, in kind of quick story on this, and what do you think, or does that relate? Do you get where I'm coming from? Kind of invite them in to the conversation. Because the one risk of storytelling is it can quickly become all about you if you're not careful, even though you don't intend it to be about you. And it may come off to the person that, oh, this guy's, yammering on and on about himself, when that's not your intent. Your intent is just to tell a good story. So you have to kind of recognize your audience and whether they'll, is it a 30-second story or a 60-second story or a 10-second story, and how do you want to play it?
Good point. Thank you.
Yeah, no, good. These are all great questions. I know you've got to get off to your breakouts, but I'm happy to take one more if there's anything left. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. I have one chat. Sorry, let me just.
Oh, good.
From Patrick. What was the largest challenge you had to overcome when dealing with Super Bowl 50? That's going to take way too long in this conversation to answer. Largest challenge to overcome when doing Super Bowl 50, I'd say the number one thing was preparing a market to host an event as big and as important as the Super Bowl, and having them realize, how this is really going to change the Bay Area for a couple of weeks, but hopefully permanently for good with our $13 million that we raised for philanthropy. But when you're in charge of an event that is a cultural institution like the Super Bowl, you're managing expectations and perceptions all the time. And so that was my constant challenge, is to not turn into a politician, but to recognize that there had to be a little bit of politician in you to be able to pitch what you were going to do and get people to understand how big this was. I mean, more people watch the Super Bowl every year than vote in the presidential election. I hope that's not the case this year, but it's a fact. About 20% more people watch the Super Bowl than vote for our president. That'll give you a sense of how important people think the Super Bowl is. So, this is when you're running an event of that size and scale, the pressure's on, but you just have to deal with it and hire a great team and plow through it. And by making the Bay Area realize just that, how important it was to the rest of the country, they were ready. And they had my back, from police, fire, city services, San Francisco 49ers, city of Santa Clara, the 99 cities that comprise the Bay Area. We were all together and we were all in it, and we delivered a great event because everybody realized that it was that important. So that was a challenge, but I think we were able to manage it. A good question, Patrick.
Applicable today for sure. Thank you, Keith. We so appreciate your time, and especially in the middle of the night in London. So
no, it's all right. I'm still up at this time. I'm kind of a late owl, so not a problem. I wish you all the best of luck, my fellow brothers, and good luck with your year. I know it'll be challenging. It's challenging for all of us, but hopefully a few of these pieces of advice will resonate. And with that, I'll say goodnight.